want to segue into this question of the debate over decolonization. And I really appreciate the nuances you bring to a lot of these debates. And then you refuse the binary positions, either or. And in this case, the question I'm going to pose to you is about decolonization. And as you know, there's a debate about how it's being taken up. On the one hand, it seems to have been conceptually inflated so that we decolonize everything. And then there's a reaction to that where we want to restrict it to retain its political power. In Indigenous voices like Tucken Wang, about decolonization is about decolonizing the land, reclaiming the territory. And as I read you, you're somewhere in between. I may be misreading you, but could you really articulate a bit for me where your position is and why?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I think, in terms of how, at least in the context of the book was written prior to that debate emerging, although of course it's been there for a long time, but emerging in the context of that article anyway. And so I did think about it after. I was like, oh, this book's going to be read as like being unclear on this debate. I think your reading is correct, if I were to give it thought. I think I fall in the context, or fall in the middle. For me, definitely the primary struggle that one identifies decolonization with is undoubtedly Indigenous struggles, and particularly Indigenous struggles in a global context. Against white settler colonialism in Canada, and understanding decolonization. Yeah, it's not just a metaphor to radicalize everything, right? It is a metaphor of reclamation of land, of culture, of nationhood, which has been resurgent on these lands for so long, and that is alive, right? Again, that there are live laws on these lands. There are still laws and ceremony and protocols that govern how people are and how people need to be on these lands. And so for me, that is definitely the core of decolonization. Again, at a global level, which is how do we respect people's autonomy, and how are borders actually violated across the global south, right? Like military occupation and economic trade agreements are constantly violating people's borders and autonomy, if you will. But I do also see the need to decolonize within our movements. And I wouldn't use that term actually in the same ways. Maybe I would find another word, but I don't know that another word exists.
Well, you sometimes say deconstruction or critical analysis.
Critical, yeah, they don't sound as good.
Critical in front of anything seems to signal something, but you have taken up the term decolonizing a lot in your book. And you talk a lot of decolonizing that has to happen within the movements and against governments and the way things are. And it's clear that decolonization for you is a very important practice, an intellectual practice, a material practice, an ethical practice. So I just really see that you still see it as useful, but you at the same time acknowledge where Tuck and Wang are coming from. Yeah, and I do think that it's useful, particularly as a paradigm. And for me, they flow from each other. Like, I do hear the critique that everything is decolonized, but I also think if we are serious, not in appropriating, co-opting ways, but again, if we are serious about decolonizing and understanding Indigenous laws, then a lot of other forms of decolonization flow from that. For example, the different territories that I've lived on, one of the teachings that I have heard and learnt about is, the idea of decolonization is also fundamentally about people being human, and understanding, sacred circles, for example, and all the different gender roles that people bring into the circle and into ceremony. And so for me, when I talk about decolonizing our movements, decolonizing ideas of who's worthy, who's not, decolonizing ideas of gender binaries, those do also stem from Indigenous understandings of deconstructing all of those binaries as well. So I hear the critique, and I also think when it comes to its kind of, when we play it out and we enact and embody decolonization under an Indigenous paradigm, then we also arrive often at the same place. And so for me, I hear the critique as people who take up decolonization as kind of the sexy word to deconstruct things, but without taking seriously Indigenous sovereignty as central to
decolonization. But I do think they are all connected when we actually look at it in a holistic way. And so for me, which is why for me the primary one in the book that I suggest first is decolonization in relationship to Indigenous struggles. And for me, all the other forms of decolonization, if you will, flow from that, which is our ethical practice, right? And decolonizing the ways in which we enact and embody ways of being. And I think for me, one of the main reasons that I use decolonization as an overarching kind of framework, if you will, is because for me it also stands in counter a little bit to the idea of prefiguration. So in a lot of activist communities that I'm part of, prefiguration is this idea of we're going to build a new society.
Right. It's a utopian concept.
A bit of a utopian concept, and that we're building the new in the shell of the old.
Yeah.
And so for me, decolonization is also a counter to that.
Yes.
Which is that idea that actually we have inherited and are living alongside, again, locally and globally, alongside very, ancient systems of being that are the kind of prefiguration that people are looking for. And so for me, bringing back decolonization as central is also, in my mind, because this was also written, the book was written in the context of an anarchist series, was to challenge the kind of really white Eurocentric idea of prefiguration as needing to look towards something new rather than actually looking towards systems that exist.
I'm really glad you said that, because there are a couple of books out now that are in the anarchist vein that have elevated this concept of prefiguration. But you're actually writing against that kind of Eurocentric notion of a utopian concept of the new arising out of the ashes of the old. You're trying to say prefiguration from a decolonizing justice migrant sense is at the one time a tearing down of what exists and modeling something quite new that doesn't relate to the old. Is that right?
Yeah, and modeling something that is also based on
much
older.
Much older than the modernist systems that we've inherited, the modern state system, the legal governance system that we've inherited. And it's prefiguring but drawing back on something pre-modern. Or using another way, an alternative modernity, because we don't want to be constantly positioning, Indigenous knowledges as somehow
old. Absolutely.
Even though they are ancient, but they're an alternative modern system that we want to draw on. Does that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that, again, and that are actually alive and well.
Yeah.
So it's not that we need to completely prefigure and reinvent. That if we look, that these systems are alive. Again, there are alive Indigenous laws on these lands, and there are communities all around the world who have governance systems, who have protocols around how people are, what people's relationships to each other is and are, what people's roles and responsibilities to each other on the land, to elders, to young people, to each other, and not to romanticize it, but to say that these systems are actually alive and well, and they date back and continue today. And so I don't know if I'm speaking against prefiguration, but definitely trying to add to how prefiguration is understood in the anarchist body of thought, of how to dismantle systems, but when this idea that when we are quote unquote reinventing ways of being, that we're not starting from scratch, that this is not a Eurocentric white anarchist project where people have suddenly realized how to be in terms of ethical orientations.
And you're very aware of the danger of contamination. The DNA of the old system is already there in the new one that you're trying to build. The Gramscian stuff. Okay.
That's the context for it.
That's really, really important. I think that clarifying that point is really, really important. Thank you for that.